In February 1944, a German U-boat operating off the coast of Iceland intercepted a distress signal from what appeared to be a damaged American escort destroyer. What the crew retrieved from the icy waters that night wasn't wreckage from battle. It was a device that would become one of the most humiliating technical puzzles of the Kriegsmarine's Atlantic campaign. Oberleutnant zur See Heinrich Müller had commanded U-537 through 14 patrols. He knew the sound of Allied radar. He knew the weight of their technology. He knew the hum of their vacuum tubes and the precision of their calibration. But when his salvage team hauled the rectangular grey box aboard that night, dripping with salt water and wrapped in canvas, Müller felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years of war: confusion. The device was lighter than it should have been. The casing felt wrong. And when the chief engineer pried open the sealed compartment with a crowbar, expecting to find circuits and magnetrons, he found something else entirely: wood. Not wreckage, not debris, not the remnants of a fire or structural failure. Deliberate, machined, lacquered wood shaped into coils, panels, and what appeared to be antenna reflectors. The crew stood silent in the cramped control room, staring at the object under the red glow of the emergency lights. Someone laughed nervously. Then the laughter died. "Is this a joke?" the engineer whispered. Müller didn't answer. He was already drafting the report he would have to send to Kiel. A report that would sound insane. A report that would question either his competence or the integrity of American engineering, or worse, both. The device was catalogued, photographed, and stored in a watertight locker. U-537 continued its patrol, but the wooden radar became a ghost aboard the submarine. No one spoke of it openly. No one could explain it. And no one wanted to be the first to suggest that the Americans had been deceiving them with props. 3 weeks later, U-537 surfaced near the Faroe Islands to rendezvous with a supply ship. Müller handed over the device personally, along with a sealed envelope containing his observations. He never saw it again. The supply officer logged it as recovered navigational equipment and said nothing more. But Heinrich Müller couldn't stop thinking about it. At night in his bunk, he replayed the moment the casing had opened, the grain of the wood, the smell of varnish, the hollow sound it made when tapped. It haunted him more than depth charges ever had, because if the Americans were using wooden decoys to confuse German salvage operations, it meant they understood something the Kriegsmarine didn't. It meant they were playing a different game. And it meant that every piece of intelligence recovered from the Atlantic might be a lie. By April, U-537 had been reassigned to Arctic waters. Müller never received a response to his report. The wooden radar was never mentioned in any official debrief. It simply vanished into the labyrinth of wartime bureaucracy, filed somewhere between operational failures and things too embarrassing to acknowledge. But the crew remembered. And in the years after the war, when survivors gathered in quiet corners of Hamburg and Bremerhaven, someone would eventually bring it up. The wooden radar. The device that made no sense. The proof that something about the Atlantic War had been fundamentally misunderstood. Heinrich Müller died in 1961, still wondering if he had been part of an elaborate deception, or if the wooden radar had been real, and its purpose something far stranger than anyone dared to admit. The device arrived at the Kriegsmarine's Technical Intelligence Division in Kiel on March 9, 1944, packed in a steel crate marked "Recovered Enemy Equipment, Priority Analysis." It sat unopened for 11 days. When Kapitän zur See Werner Hartmann finally broke the seal, he expected another salvaged radar unit, something to reverse engineer, something to compare against existing Luftwaffe models, something to justify the resources spent on Atlantic intelligence operations. What he found instead was a contradiction wrapped in varnish. The outer casing was authentic American military issue. The serial numbers matched known production patterns from General Electric's Philadelphia plant. The mounting brackets were regulation. The weatherproofing was standard. But inside Where magnetrons and waveguides should have been, there was only wood, carved, layered and assembled with the kind of precision normally reserved for optical instruments. Hartmann ordered a full materials analysis. The wood was identified as birch plywood, treated with phenolic resin and coated with conductive paint to simulate metallic surfaces. The antenna was a hollow frame wrapped in copper wire that conducted nothing. The power supply was a weighted box filled with sand to match the expected mass of transformer coils. It was a perfect replica, and it was completely non-functional. The initial hypothesis was sabotage, that American factory workers had deliberately produced fake units to waste German analysis time. But that theory collapsed under scrutiny. The serial numbers were too accurate, the documentation too consistent, and the deployment pattern too strategic. Hartmann requested access to previous salvage reports. He wanted to know if other U-boats had recovered similar devices. The archives revealed something disturbing. Over the past 18 months, at least 7 radar units had been retrieved from the North Atlantic, catalogued and forwarded to technical divisions across occupied Europe. None had been fully analyzed. Most had been lost in transit or destroyed during Allied bombing raids, but 3 remained. And when Hartmann had them exhumed from storage depots in France and Norway, he discovered they were identical to the wooden unit from U-537. Same construction, same weight, same deceptive authenticity. Someone at the Allied command level had designed a system to flood German intelligence with worthless artifacts, and it had worked for over a year. Hartmann drafted a classified memo to the Naval High Command. He titled it Assessment of Deceptive Equipment Recovery in Atlantic Operations. He outlined the implications. If the Allies were planting fake radar units, they were also aware of German salvage protocols. They knew which ships were being targeted. They knew which technologies the Kriegsmarine prioritized, and they were deliberately poisoning the intelligence stream. The memo was filed under Counterintelligence, Allied Deception Operations, and marked for restricted circulation. Only 3 copies were printed. 2 were destroyed in the bombing of Berlin in 1945. The 3rd survived, locked in a vault in East Germany until 1989, when it was discovered during the Reunification Archives Review. By then, Werner Hartmann was long dead. He had been transferred to a desk job in Hamburg in late 1944, quietly sidelined after his report was deemed speculative and demoralizing to operational morale. He spent the final months of the war reviewing supply requisitions and never returned to active intelligence work. But the wooden radar remained. It was moved from Kiel to a storage facility outside Munich, where it sat among thousands of other unclassified wartime artifacts. No one knew what to do with it. No one wanted to admit what it represented, and so it waited, a silent witness to a war fought not just with steel and explosives, but with deception, misdirection, and the slow, corrosive realization that the enemy had been smarter than anyone wanted to believe. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The Allied deception operation had a code name, though most of the men involved never knew it. It was called Operation Timberwolf, and it began in November 1942 at a requisitioned furniture factory outside Philadelphia. The architect of the operation was Commander James Caldwell, a former naval intelligence officer who had spent the early months of the war analyzing German salvage patterns. Caldwell noticed something the rest of the Navy had overlooked. The Kriegsmarine was obsessed with recovering intact Allied technology. U-boats were taking extraordinary risks to retrieve radar equipment, sonar arrays, and radio transmitters from sinking ships. They were sacrificing operational security for the chance to bring back a working American radar unit. Caldwell saw an opportunity. If the Germans wanted American radar so badly, he would give it to them, just not the real thing. He recruited a team of naval engineers, furniture craftsmen, and special effects designers. Their task was simple: build radar units that looked, felt, and weighed exactly like the real equipment, but functioned as nothing more than expensive decoys. The devices had to survive saltwater immersion, pass visual inspection, and fool anyone who didn't perform a full electrical analysis. The first prototype took 6 weeks to build. It was a masterpiece of theatrical engineering. The exterior casing was salvaged from a damaged SCR-584 radar unit. The internal components were carved from kiln-dried birch, shaped to mimic the geometry of magnetrons and waveguides. Copper wire was coiled around wooden dowels to simulate inductors. Lead weights were embedded in the base to match the expected mass. Even the mounting bolts were authentic military issue, complete with inspection stamps and serial numbers. The final touch was the weathering. Each unit was subjected to controlled seawater exposure, impact testing, and surface abrasion to replicate the damage a real radar would sustain during combat. By the time the team finished, the decoys were indistinguishable from operational equipment, at least to anyone examining them under battlefield conditions. Between January 1943 and August 1944, Operation Timberwolf produced 127 fake radar units. They were distributed to escort destroyers, convoy support ships, and Atlantic patrol vessels with strict instructions. If the ship was in danger of being boarded or sunk, the crew was to jettison the decoy in a manner that made it appear accidental. Damaged equipment lost during evasive maneuvers, swept overboard during rough seas, or ejected from a burning compartment. The operation was never officially documented. There were no memos, no budget allocations, no personnel files. Caldwell ran it as a black project, funded through discretionary Navy intelligence accounts and staffed by men who signed secrecy oaths that lasted until their deaths. But it worked. German salvage reports began citing recovered radar units that require further analysis or show unusual internal construction. Technical intelligence divisions in Kiel, Berlin, and occupied Paris wasted hundreds of hours trying to reverse engineer devices that had no function. And more importantly, the Germans began to doubt their own intelligence assessments. If one radar unit was fake, how many others were? If the Allies were planting decoys, what else were they lying about? The corrosive effect of uncertainty spread through the Kriegsmarine's technical divisions. Trust in salvaged intelligence eroded. Reports became hedged with qualifications, and the entire system of Atlantic technology recovery slowed to a crawl. James Caldwell never received recognition for Operation Timberwolf. He was transferred to the Pacific Theater in 1944 and spent the rest of the war coordinating airfield logistics in the Philippines. He never spoke publicly about the wooden radars. And when he died in 1978, his family found no records of the operation among his personal papers, only a single photograph taken in the Philadelphia factory showing a man in a naval uniform standing beside a wooden crate marked GE Radar Unit, Handle with Care. The operation was declassified in fragments between 1982 and 1991, buried in footnotes of larger intelligence reviews. Most historians missed it, and those who noticed dismissed it as a minor wartime curiosity, a clever trick that had no real impact on the outcome of the Atlantic campaign. But they were wrong. Operation Timberwolf didn't sink U-boats or break codes. It did something more insidious. It taught the Germans to distrust their own salvage operations. It made them question every piece of recovered technology. And it turned the Atlantic into a theater where even physical evidence could be a lie. The wooden radars were never weapons. They were doubts, cast into the water and retrieved by men who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what else they had been wrong about. Heinrich Müller never forgot the wooden radar. Even after U-537 was decommissioned and he returned to civilian life in Hamburg, the memory haunted him with the persistence of unfinished business. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Müller attended a reunion of former U-boat officers in Bremen. The gathering was small, subdued, and heavy with the weight of things no one wanted to say aloud. They drank beer in a basement hall, decorated with faded naval flags, and spoke carefully around the subjects that mattered: lost comrades, sunken boats, the moral calculus of serving a regime that had destroyed their country. Late in the evening, after most of the older officers had left, Müller found himself at a table with three men who had served on different boats in the Atlantic campaign. The conversation drifted toward intelligence failures. The missed convoys, the false coordinates, the salvaged equipment that had promised breakthroughs but delivered nothing. Someone mentioned recovered radar units. Müller's hand tightened around his glass. "I pulled one from the water in '44, he said quietly. "Off Iceland. It was wood." The table went silent. Then one of the other officers, a man named Klaus Fischer, who had commanded U-221, leaned forward. "Grey casing, GE serial numbers." Müller nodded. Fischer exhaled slowly. "We got one too. April 43, North Atlantic. Command told us it was a priority recovery. We risked surfacing in daylight to haul it aboard." He paused. "My engineer opened it 3 days later, wood and copper wire. We thought it was sabotage." A third officer, younger, spoke up. "U-198, September 43, same thing. We didn't report it. We thought we'd been tricked by our own supply chain, that someone in Lorient had swapped the real unit for a dummy to sell on the black market." The fourth man said nothing, but his expression confirmed he had seen one too. They sat in silence, the realization settling over them like cold seawater. The wooden radars hadn't been isolated incidents. They had been a deliberate, coordinated operation. And the Kriegsmarine had either never understood it or had understood it and chosen not to tell the crews. "Did you ever receive a response to your report?" Fischer asked Müller. "No, nothing. It disappeared into Kiel, and I never heard another word." Fischer nodded. "Same. We were told to continue standard salvage operations and not discuss the matter." The younger officer laughed bitterly. "They knew. Command knew. And they let us keep wasting time pulling fake equipment out of the ocean." Müller didn't laugh. He was thinking about the hours spent analyzing that wooden radar, the debates in the control room, the doubt that had crept into every subsequent salvage operation. If the Americans could fake one device, they could fake anything. And once that doubt took root, it poisoned everything. "Do you know what bothers me most?" Müller said. "It's not that they tricked us. It's that they understood us well enough to know we'd take the bait. They knew we were desperate for their technology. They knew we'd risk surfacing. They knew we'd waste resources trying to reverse engineer it. They played us like a radio frequency we couldn't stop listening to." Fischer nodded slowly. "It means they were inside our decision-making process. They knew our priorities better than we did." The conversation drifted to other subjects after that. Families, jobs, the difficulty of rebuilding a life when the world you knew had been erased. But the wooden radars stayed with them, an unresolved question that would outlast the beer and the nostalgia, and the carefully maintained fiction that they had simply been sailors doing their duty. Years later, in 1967, Müller was interviewed by a graduate student researching U-boat operations. The student asked about technological intelligence during the Atlantic campaign. Müller hesitated, then mentioned the wooden radar. The student wrote it down, thanked him, and moved on to other questions. The interview was never published. The wooden radar was relegated to a footnote in an unpublished dissertation that gathered dust in a university library until it was digitized in 2003. By then, Müller was dead, Fischer was dead, and the younger officer had moved to Argentina and stopped responding to letters. But the story survived. Because even decades later, the men who had seen the wooden radars couldn't stop asking the same question. What else had they been wrong about? The wooden radar recovered by U-537 was not destroyed. It was not lost. It was archived. In 1968, during a routine inventory of unclassified wartime materials at a storage facility outside Stuttgart, A German military historian named Dr. Erich Volland discovered a crate labeled Recovered Allied Equipment, Analysis Incomplete, 1944. Inside was the wooden radar, wrapped in yellowed canvas and packed with documentation that had never been fully processed. Volland was researching Allied deception operations for a book on intelligence warfare. He had read scattered references to fake equipment drops, dummy installations, and inflatable tanks, but nothing about wooden radar units. The discovery intrigued him. He requested permission to analyze the device and cross-reference it with surviving Kriegsmarine intelligence reports. What he found was a pattern. Between 1943 and 1944, at least 14 U-boats had reported recovering anomalous radar equipment. Most of the reports had been filed under inconclusive analysis or requires further investigation. None had been followed up, none had been correlated, and none had triggered any kind of operational alert. Volland began tracking down survivors. He interviewed former U-boat officers, engineers, and intelligence analysts. Most were reluctant to discuss the subject. Some denied any knowledge of wooden radars. But a few, men like Heinrich Müller and Klaus Fischer, admitted they had seen the devices and had been told to forget about them. One former intelligence analyst, speaking on condition of anonymity, told Volland, "We knew they were fakes. We knew by mid-1943, but we couldn't admit it publicly because it would have meant admitting we'd been deceived for months. It would have undermined confidence in all salvage operations, so we buried it." Volland's book, Deception in the Atlantic, Allied Intelligence Operations, 1942 to 1945, was published in 1973. It included a chapter on Operation Timberwolf, based on declassified American documents and his own research into German archives. The chapter was 32 pages long and meticulously sourced. It was largely ignored. Military historians dismissed it as a minor footnote. Popular audiences found it too technical, and veterans on both sides had no interest in revisiting the subject. But the wooden radar itself survived. It was transferred to the Deutsches Museum in Munich in 1981, where it was catalogued as American Radar Decoy, World War II. It was never put on public display. It sat in a climate-controlled storage room alongside thousands of other objects deemed too obscure or too controversial for exhibition. In 2007, a museum curator named Anna Brandt was preparing an exhibit on wartime technology and deception. She requested access to the wooden radar. When she opened the crate, she found the device exactly as Volland had left it, still wrapped in canvas, still bearing the original serial numbers, still smelling faintly of varnish and salt. Brandt arranged for a full technical analysis. Experts confirmed the construction methods, the materials, and the probable origin. They also found something Volland had missed: faint pencil markings on the interior wooden panels, names, initials, dates. The signatures of the craftsman who had built the device in Philadelphia in 1943. One marking read, J.C. Nov, 42. They'll never know. James Caldwell, the architect of Operation Timberwolf, a man who had died 30 years earlier without ever receiving recognition for his work. Brandt included the wooden radar in her exhibit. It was displayed in a glass case with a placard explaining its history: the Philadelphia factory, the U-boat recovery, the decades of silence. The exhibit ran for 6 months and attracted modest attention. But the wooden radar's story didn't end there. Because in 2019, a German documentary filmmaker named Lars Hartmann, no relation to Werner Hartmann, produced a film titled The Wooden War. It told the story of Operation Timberwolf, using interviews with historians, archival footage, and the wooden radar itself as a central visual motif. The film was broadcast on German public television and later released online. It found a small but dedicated audience, and it revived interest in a question that had been buried for 70 years. How many other pieces of wartime intelligence had been deliberate lies? The wooden radar is still in Munich. It's no longer in storage. It's part of the museum's permanent collection, displayed alongside a placard that reads, "A reminder that in war, even physical evidence can be a weapon." If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. The men who built the wooden radars were never soldiers. They were furniture makers, theater technicians, model builders, craftsmen recruited from Philadelphia's industrial districts and given a task that sounded absurd until they understood its purpose. One of them was Thomas Brennan, a 62-year-old carpenter who had spent 40 years building custom cabinets and architectural moldings. In November 1942, he received a letter from the U.S. Navy requesting his presence at a requisitioned factory on the outskirts of the city. The letter didn't explain why. It simply said his skills were needed for specialized wartime production and that he would be compensated at double his normal wage. Brennan arrived at the factory on a cold morning and was led into a workshop filled with machine tools, lumber, and what appeared to be dismantled radar equipment. A naval officer introduced himself as Commander Caldwell and explained the project. They were going to build fake radar units so convincing that German intelligence would waste months trying to understand them. Brennan's first reaction was to laugh. His second was to ask if the officer was serious. Caldwell handed him a blueprint. "We need precision, we need authenticity, and we need you to make wood look like something it's not." Brennan studied the plans. The internal geometry was complex: curved panels, nested chambers, hollow tubes that mimicked waveguides. It wasn't impossible, but it would require techniques he'd only ever used for decorative work: steam bending, laminated construction, precision joinery. He asked how many units they needed. Caldwell said they didn't know yet, as many as it took. Brennan signed a secrecy agreement that same day. He never told his wife what he was working on. He never discussed it with the other craftsmen. And for the next 18 months, he spent his days carving, sanding, and assembling wooden components that would be shipped across the Atlantic and pulled from the ocean by men who would never know his name. The work was meticulous. Every panel had to be cut to within a 1/16 of an inch. Every joint had to be seamless. Every surface had to be finished with the kind of care normally reserved for museum-quality furniture. Brennan treated each unit like a commissioned piece, checking tolerances, testing fits, sanding by hand until the wood felt like metal. He worked alongside a dozen other craftsmen: a clockmaker, a violin repairer, a retired shipwright, a theatrical prop designer. They rarely spoke. They simply worked, each focused on their assigned components, assembling the devices like elaborate puzzles. Brennan never saw the finished radars deployed. He never knew which ships carried them or which U-boats recovered them. He only knew that every few weeks another batch of wooden panels would be coated with conductive paint, packed into authentic GE casings, and loaded onto trucks bound for the Philadelphia Naval Yard. The factory closed in August 1944. The workers were thanked, paid, and reminded never to discuss what they had built. Brennan returned to his cabinet shop and resumed making kitchen cupboards and bedroom furniture. He never mentioned the wooden radars to anyone, but he kept one piece, a small wooden panel left over from a failed prototype, carved with the same precision he'd used on the operational units. He sanded it smooth, varnished it, and hung it on the wall of his workshop. To anyone who asked, he said it was a sample of his wartime contract work. Nothing more. Thomas Brennan died in 1971. His workshop was sold. The wooden panel disappeared into an estate sale and was never identified. But somewhere in Philadelphia, possibly hanging in someone's home or sitting in an antique shop, there is a piece of Operation Timberwolf, a fragment of a war fought with varnish and precision, where the most effective weapons were the ones that looked real but contained nothing but doubt. The wooden radar never sank a U-boat. It never intercepted a signal or guided a weapon. It never saved a convoy or turned the tide of a battle. But it did something far more insidious. It made the enemy doubt their own intelligence. It taught them to question what they saw, to hesitate before acting on recovered technology, to second-guess the value of every salvaged device. And in a war where speed and certainty were survival, doubt was as deadly as a torpedo. Heinrich Müller died in 1961, still haunted by the wooden radar. Werner Hartmann died in 1978, his memo on Allied deception buried in archives no one read. Thomas Brennan died in 1971, never knowing if his work had mattered. And James Caldwell died in 1978, having never received public recognition for Operation Timberwolf. But the wooden radar survived. It outlasted the men who built it, the men who deployed it, and the men who recovered it. It sat in storage for decades, forgotten, until historians began piecing together the fragmented story of one of the war's strangest deception operations. Today, the device sits in Munich, a relic of a conflict where the most effective weapons weren't always the ones that exploded. It's a reminder that war is fought not just with steel and explosives, but with perception, misdirection, and the patient erosion of trust. And it asks a question that still resonates. How many other lies were we told? How many other artifacts were plants? How many other pieces of intelligence were carefully crafted illusions designed to make us waste time, resources, and faith in our own judgment? The wooden radar offers no answers. It simply sits behind glass, silent and inert, a monument to the idea that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one that looks real but contains nothing but air. The war ended. The archives were opened. The survivors spoke. But the wooden radar remains, proof that in 1944 a German U-boat crew pulled a lie from the Atlantic, believed it long enough to doubt everything else, and passed that doubt down through the ranks until it became part of the fabric of defeat. The wood is still smooth, the varnish still gleams, the serial numbers are still legible. And somewhere in the grain, if you look closely enough, you can still see the faint pencil marks left by a carpenter who knew that the best deceptions are built with care. The war ended, but the wood still remembers the sound of men who believed something that was never real. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and unsettling cases. Thank you for following the story of the wooden radar that deceived a navy. See you in the next video.